Elnaz Rekabi, the 33-year-old Iranian rock climber who refused to wear a hijab during the International Federation of Sport Climbing's Asian Championship in South Korea, arrived back in Iran early this morning. Her return comes amid national protests in Iran following the arrest and death of a woman who wore her hijab improperly.
Following the competition, Rakabi explained the entire situation was an accident due to unexpectedly being called to climb the wall, which resulted in a problem with her head covering. Joining us now to discuss is journalist and host of the Iran podcast, Negar Mortazavi. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So do you accept this explanation for what happened, and then, tell us more about the situation in Iran presently?
I don't think many Iranians accept that. Elnaz Rekabi showed a very brave and courageous act of civil disobedience when she showed up to the wall. Sometimes women claim that their hijab fell off, for example, in Iran when the morality police shows up. But we don't even see a hijab around her neck. She showed up without it, and she did her competition, and she came down. It looks like an act of civil disobedience, but also while returning to Iran, because she's part of the official team in the country, there's a lot of pressure on her. I'm sure there's pressure on her family, and it looks like she is under pressure making these statements. Nevertheless, I think that act of civil disobedience, it made headlines. The images are all over, and people are really praising her bravery and courage.
So other women who have been in a similar situation have been pressured to post on social media that it was an accident to try to, deflate the political valence of what they've done. And others have chosen not to go back to Iran at all for fear of reprisal. The implication here is that because she had to go back with the team, perhaps, that she went ahead and, under some pressure, posted on social media that it was in fact an accident.
That's correct. So we have had similar instances in the past, and sometimes the athlete is immediately forced into exile. So of the fear, they won't even return back to the country. Or once they do, they will be put under pressure. They could be expelled from the team, or it could have very severe security consequences for them, even be detained. So I think the pressure that's put on her, obviously, we don't know the behind the scenes, but the pressure, the immense pressure that's going to be put on her coaches, maybe even her family, seems to have resulted in this. And she seems to have wanting to return back to the country and continue her athletic career in the country. But obviously, this is one result of the pressure that she's coming out and essentially denouncing her own act of civil disobedience, or bringing up an excuse that I don't think is very much believable by many Iranians.
Tell us more about the protests. How are they being organized? What is that like, and how dangerous is it given how the government operates in the country?
So the protests were first sparked about a month ago by the death of this 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Gina Mahsa Amini, who was picked up by the morality police and later died in police custody. She goes into a coma and dies in a hospital. The state immediately puts out a statement saying she had underlying health conditions. Later, they said she had a heart attack, but her family has been challenging that and saying that she was subjected to violence and brutality. The protests were started in Kurdistan, in Tehran, where she was initially detained by the morality police, and then it spread to all provinces across the country, dozens of cities, including some religious cities, Qom and Mashhad. We see an intersectional communities of protesters. It's led by a lot of women, young girls, schoolgirls are now also joining very bravely these protests. But we also see laborers, workers, teachers, university students, lawyers, and most recently oil workers joining with strikes, with protests. So it's a diverse combination of different segments, and we're hearing very radical slogans against the entirety of the regime, the Islamic Republic, the supreme leader, the senior leadership. It's a legitimacy crisis that the regime has been dealing with for years. And also it's a culmination of years of anger by women who are pushing back against discrimination and violence.
Well, Iran has agreed to ship more missiles and drones to Russia after Vice President Mohammad Mokber and other leading officials visited Moscow on October the 6th. An Iranian diplomat denied that the transfer breaches the 2015 UN Security Council resolution, saying how and where the weapons are used is not of issue to the seller. So obviously, this is an interesting moment on the international stage. Russia and Iran possibly having a closer relationship. The U.S. obviously backed out of the Iran deal under the Trump administration, is now having conversations with them again. How does the protesting on the ground change or complicate, what Iran's diplomatic situation is internationally with Russia and the U.S.?
Well, the protest or the domestic unrest definitely creates a legitimacy crisis that the regime has to deal with while they're dealing with their foreign policy issues with the country, and it delegitimizes their position when it comes to their presence on the world stage. And the Iranian administration, with a hardline president, with a hardline parliament, sort of the conservative hardline camp taking over all segments of power, has made more of a shift from the West to the East, with the U.S. pull out of the nuclear negotiations, with more isolation from Europeans, U.S. and Europe. And with this takeover inside Iran of the hardliners, we've seen more of a shift from the West towards China for trade and towards Russia for military support and just military engagement with Iran. And Iran siding with Russia in this war in Ukraine is also part of that big package of that shift from the West towards the East.
Do you think it has any, does the public opinion about that realignment have any relationship to the ongoing protest and the desire to see a different administration, a different change in leadership at all? Or are those issues kind of separated in the minds of people who are speaking out right now in Iran?
Well, it's a very cool space. It's very securitized. It's very difficult to conduct opinion polls inside the country. And just public opinion doesn't really impact the country's foreign policy, regional policy much. We hear also from various different corners in the Iranian society, even some inside the country in opposition and some within the political structure, criticizing sort of this shift to the East or the stalemate when it comes to the nuclear negotiations with the U.S. and also the aligning with Russia as an aggressor on Ukraine in this war. But nevertheless, it's the strategic decision that the regime has made, and also part of that entire realignment or shift from the West to come out of that form of isolation when it comes to trade, when it comes to business, and also military power and support. Russia and China, two big powers in the East, veto members in the Security Council. They've provided political support to Iran, economic support in the face of sanctions, and it just seems like Iran is doubling down on that relationship and that support with the Eastern powers.
Negar Mortazavi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll have more Rising right after this.